Okay, welcome back to another Native American history lecture. This lecture is going to cover kind of the end of the 19th century up to the Genocide Convention in the early 1950s, late 40s, and take us. I'll mention a little bit about termination policies in the 1950s. But to start things out, I want to deal with a couple of major figures that are a little bit more closely related to where I live here in Colorado. So we'll deal a little bit with the Southwest, and I'll mention some things about the Long Walk, for example, with Dene or Navajo people. But that's also covered in Ned Blackhawk's book. So I will say some things about some Ute folks and Chief Ouray. And then I want to cover Citizenship Act as well. And one of the things I want to kind of emphasize here is the kind of um, strange relationship that Native folks have in the 20th century with the US military. Because on the one hand, what we see is from World War One onwards, we see Native folks participating in the world in the US military in world wars. In World War II, of course, we have the Navajo, or Dene is the better term, but Navajo code talkers is how they're famously known. And we know that the use of the Navajo language um, uh, really, gives the United States the upper hand in the Pacific theater of World War II against the Japanese, among other Axis forces during that time. What we see throughout the 20th century, then, this kind of conflicted relationship where we have Native American people serving in the U.S. military, and at the same time, the U.S. government continuing to oppress Native Americans as usual. So that becomes conflicted. One of the other things, and some of my veteran students might know this already, is that since the 19th century, the language that the US military uses frequently in relationship to theaters of war comes from earlier experiences in American history, such that enemy territory is still referred to as Indian territory. Um, and some of you might know that the code name used for Osama bin Laden by the military was Geronimo. So I want to talk about Geronimo a little bit here in the first part of this lecture. Uh, and it might be any of these topics might be, as we're getting closer towards research paper time, might be something to dig more into. There is a book by uh, the Ojibwe scholar and activist Winona LaDuke, who ran for vice president in the 1990s with Ralph Nader, um, uh, that called The Militarization of Indian Country. And that is a useful book for thinking about uh, um, the ongoing relationship between the military, because what we see not only with the military language that I was just referring to, we see also this problematic situation where most of the toxic waste, for example, that has been produced through military endeavors in the 20th century, a good portion of it, anyways, has been stored on native lands as well, so on native reservations. So that becomes an issue. Also, termination policies in the 1950s become an issue for Native people. So The oppression continues throughout the 20th century. So I don't mean to say that 20th century has been any kind of cakewalk for Native American peoples. But when we look back to the Wounded Knee situation in the 1890s, that is about the lowest population point that we see for Native peoples in at least in the United States. These days in 2025, we see a resurgence, thankfully, in population for Native folks. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot to talk about with respect to the 20th century, which will take us to the end of the our semester here together. So we'll turn a little bit to the Southwest into Apache Wars and to Geronimo. But we also want to um, think about, and Ned Blackhawk talks about this a little bit more in his book, so I won't cover a lot with respect to Navajo folks, but for Navajo or Dene people, so the term Navajo is kind of an outsider word to be using. So Dene is more local to the ways that people refer to themselves. So want to be attentive to that. Um, and I want to think about the relocation that's going on in the late 1800s between Dene people and also Apache people. So between about August of 1864 and the end of 1866, we see about 10,000 Navajo and 500 Mescalero Apache being forced to an internment camp in Bosque Redondo. During that forced march and internment, up to 3,500 people died from starvation and disease over a 4-year period in 1868. Then the Navajo were allowed to return to their ancestral homelands following the Treaty of Bosque Redondo, and some anthropologists state that the trauma of the Long Walk continues. So this is something that's very much in the memory of the Long Walk, and you can look up even just a quick look at Wikipedia or something like that is going to be helpful for some of the numbers and thinking about that there. But of course, um, remember that Ned Blackhawk's book doesn't deal heavily with Plains cultures because I think that in broader Native American history, Plains cultures have received a lot of attention. But the his book and also Kathleen Duvall's book do not deal heavily with that. So go back to my earlier lectures on that sort of stuff. He does deal well, and Duvall's book actually does even better, I think, with like a richer history of the Southwest as well. So something other places to look at. I'm going to jump in to move us through things today and just remind us some things about this period. So remember, the Spanish, of course, are in the Southwest well before the English begin their settler colonial process in the early 1600s. So, for a long time, the area of the Southwest was colonized by Spanish and considered by Euro-Christians to be a part of Mexico. Now, I think Blackhawk and Duvall both make this kind of point in their books as well. It's in colonial history that tells this story of the successful colonization of the Southwest. But really, the Spanish presence isn't super heavy, and the Spanish um, uh, get kicked out a number of times by the Southwest. So we don't. So from the perspective of the land, right, instead of the sea, right, which is Steve Newcomb's way of putting things. From the perspective of actually people who are living in the Southwest, maybe colonization has never been and never was like a complete sort of thing in the ways that colonial histories have told it. So a big revolt that you can think about, and in Matthew Liebman's book here, I have an image of, is in 1680. There's a major Pueblo revolt at Santa Fe led by Pope, who drove out Christians who would not let Indians practice traditional ceremonies. So, yeah, the conquistadors come in at various moments, but they're bringing priests. And what happens over and over again, this is a pattern even before the major Puebla revolt here, is that um, the the Catholic clergy come in and they start off with relations because they need to have good relationships with natives. And then once they get like a foothold, then they start getting more rigorous about their extirpation of indigenous traditional ways of having ceremony or religion, and as that in the ways that the colonizers see it. So at first, the native people are kind of welcoming and maybe even intrigued by these newcomers. But then they get tyrannical. And so there's an uprising, and they get so fed up with the Christians that they kick them out, and they're left alone for 12 years. At Santa Fe, right? Like, so the Spanish know that like they're not going to be received well if they try and return there. The revolt and other revolts like it save indigenous cultures in the Southwest and help preserve their languages and traditions in their homelands. And when we're talking about native worldview, yes, like native worldview can persist even when people have lost their cultures, but it is more intact, just like anything culturally is more intact when an indigenous language can be preserved and when people are not moved out of their homelands by force. So the revolt established a reputation among Euro-Christians that Indians from that area were also particularly hostile. And that is a stereotype that comes to be applied especially to Apache people, but it exists for a long time before the so-called Apache Wars. So Liebman's book takes a wider looks at a wider cultural impact on both Mexico and Pueblo culture. Shift back to that perspective that I was giving in a previous lecture about state formation, right? So you see these treaties being made with Native people, and then within just even a few years, in some cases, like with Colorado, then about a decade, all of a sudden Colorado Territory gets named, even though this was like from the Treaty of Fort Laramie was all supposed to be Native land. The state Nebraska comes from a Lakota word that means why I think something like wide, shallow water, like the Platte River. That Lakota word is entrenched in the history there. And then remember, I had mentioned that because of the politics back east, especially in the 1880s and 1890s, and that shift between Democrats and Republicans. Remember, the blue is the Southern Democrats were the legacy of the Civil War at this point in time, and and then the Republicans were that extension of the of Lincoln's party, right, in the late 19th century. So, statehood is being formed, and we can look at the gray areas and see what areas are the last to be colonized in terms of state formation, as well. So, when we're looking at native resistance, as present from early on, we can really see that the resistance of the Southwest has been a long, like centuries long resistance to European Euro-Christian folks. Um, Natives in the Caribbean quickly got word to people on the continents as well. That's something to be thinking about if we're thinking about from the continent. I focus mostly on the northern continent, but there's a lot more to be said about the southern continent that I haven't been able to cover this semester, other than the early archaeology and anthropology stuff. So I'm going to look at this figure, Goyale, the one who yawns, Mescalero Chiricahua Apache. This is another name for what who the Euro Christians will name Geronimo, or not name, but called Geronimo. He's born or lives, from somewhere around 1829. He's born into the Bedonkoho, Bedonkohe band of Indahe Apache people in present-day New Mexico. And contrary to popular belief, Geronimo is not exactly a chief and did not like it when people referred to him that way. And that'll show up like because Geronimo can be a controversial figure within different Apache communities as well. So in 1835, he Mexico places a bounty on Apache scalps after multiple raids. Now, remember, there's a lot to be said about scalping in general, but scalping and for bounties in the process is actually in some ways it changes in different areas and different places over time. So it's like there's a recent book about it, and I'm forgetting the name right now, but you can email me if you're a student of mine, and I'll give you the name of it. Um, uh, but it is something that is practiced like on different continents of the world in different areas in different ways. But this idea of scalping for bounty that creates the professionalization of Indian killers is something that the colonizers bring and then gets placed back or read back onto native peoples and also terrifies the Euro-Christian communities. So remember when I was talking in an earlier lecture about uh, the War of 1812, for example, and the Euro-Christians being terrified of this kind of war, even though they've declared a war of extermination on native peoples, they are afraid of native people coming and scalping them. But that is a process that was began by the Euro-Christian colonizers in terms of the scalping for bounty, like paying people for a first hair and scalps. But we see it from earlier on in the colonization of Ireland, the taking of heads, for example, and heads are too heavy to carry. And so, but also that process of putting heads on spikes that we see on in the early, even the Plymouth colonies, right? We see that kind of thing going on, and that's a practice that the Euro-Christians bring with them. So, in any case, Mexico places a bounty on scalps, Apache scalps, after the multiple raids on uh, Mexican towns. At about 17 years old, Geronimo marries his wife and has three children. They and his entire village are then massacred in 1851 by Mexican troops under Jose Maria Carrasco. When Goyale returned from trading in town, he found them murdered and scalped. Um, he narrates this in his own autobiography, which you can read or listen to in podcast form. Might be something to dig into for a final project as well. But you can also see how this kind of narrative of like having a family destroyed or taken, we've seen that kind of narrative placed onto Tecumseh, for example. But we also see that, and you want to be careful about this. You see it all over popular culture with dealing with native peoples. And so, for example, think of like what's the Mel Gibson movie? Like there's it's like a picked character part that Mel Gibson plays, whether he's Mad Max, or whether there's a film where he's a Scottish guy. It's not Rob Roy. It's another name. I'm sorry for forgetting the names of Mel Gibson's movies. Um, you see this like it's like this young person, kind of fringe slash like kind of indigenous group, and then the state government comes in if it's like the British troops coming in to Scotland, for example. Then they kill a family member, they kill a wife, and that like sparks rage among the hero of the story, and then they go on this kind of rampage. And so I want to be careful about the ways that popular culture has already created narratives or is in the process of creating narratives that then justify or raise up a particular person like Geronimo into this kind of figure who goes into this wild frenzy, and then is ultimately captured. And then we lament, the Euro-Christians lament, like the Euro-Christians lament. They respect Tecumseh so much that the at least the Americans then sort of praise him, right? That's part of the colonialist romance that I mentioned, even with the statue that sits on the east side of the Colorado State Capitol today, right? This kind of colonial romance. It's like they're like the more it pumps up the savagery, so-called savagery anyway, of Native peoples, that the flip side of that is that their defeat becomes like it shows the true power of the United States, but then they can also sort of like um uh with all due seriousness, like really praise the heroic nature of the native person, right? So this is all part of some racialized stereotyping that goes on, and sometimes native people's stories play into it. Um, so here's a chronology. I'm drawing on some of ideas from, again, I mentioned Winona LaDuke. She gives an account of the Apache and Geronimo in Recovering the Sacred, which is one of her books. And so the uh, uh, I think for reasons that it's probably easy to recognize why anybody would, go into a rage after their family has been slain and murdered. Uh, uh, that definitely happens to Geronimo. And then we see him going on incursions into say Mexico is going on incursions into various Apache lands. Geronimo at one point meets General Nelson Miles. Remember, he showed up in the Plains lecture. He eventually surrenders in Arizona and is taken prisoner in Florida. He becomes a prisoner for life. He's never able to return to native lands. And so this becomes a pattern, not just for Geronimo, but for other folks who get removed, particularly to the state of Florida. He eventually becomes uh, uh, a prisoner in Alabama and then Oklahoma. He's paraded around Washington at one particular point, and then he dies in captivity, never able to return to his native lands. I love this image, and it's an image I think that Jace Weaver uses in his book, The Red Atlantic. Yeah, I've got it here in my slide. And it's great because it alters our perception, right? So this is Geronimo actually in the top hat here, um, driving an early automobile. So Jace Weaver asks us to reconsider how we think of famous chiefs of the late 19th century. They're often thought of as the last of that idealized time of freedom, but that narrative also plays into that colonial romance I was just talking about with the dying Indian. So um, that colonial romance has been being developed in American fiction for quite a while at this point, and so we really see it in the so-called leather stocking tales, which are a series of novels by James Fenimore Cooper. The most famous one being The Last of the Mohicans. And so we see the publication dates of the mid 19th century, but what they're idealizing is that time of the Seven Years' War, and then after into the formation of the United States as well. So Natty Bumppo is just one of a list of these romantic heroes, who on the white side who has like gone native, and that goes all the way up into Kevin Costner and Dances with Wolves, and there's no end to the jokes in the native community around Kevin Costner, all the way up through like, and Kevin Costner continues to play the colonizer person even in the recent Yellowstone series, for example, and owns a lot of land himself up there in that country and that ranch land. So Another figure we might think about is this European writer Karl May, who was actually Adolf Hitler's favorite writer. So Europeans were and are still enthralled with American colonial romances. So the German author Karl May would never visits the United States really, but like he makes an entire, famous makes fame for himself writing about um uh uh, Southwest people and Southwest culture in North America, even at the time that Geronimo was living. So for the novels that he writes that are set in America, my created characters of Winnetou, the wise chief of the Apaches, and the old Shatterhand or Winnetou's white brother, blood brother. So there's this kind of like that again, that, oh yes, like I am the Euro Christian or the white brother who comes and goes native in some sort of way, or I'm a half person. So there's this way of kind of like bridging the gap through some sort of blood relation. And of course, this is the time when those completely genocidal blood policies, which have no scientific basis, were being used for reservations. And then, of course, Mai's novels inspired Adolf Hitler, who actually referred to Poland and Ukraine as his Old West. So he and Nazi legal policies, as they began emerging in the 1930s, they look to U.S. law as an ideal. And the Nazi thinking is that what the U.S. did to the Native Americans by putting them on reservations was like a good step in the controlling of basically unwanted people. They just feel like the United States didn't go far enough in actually exterminating the natives, and then they come up with the final solution. So that's how they're dealing with especially Jewish people, but not only Jewish people, Romani and Sinti people as well in Eastern Europe, that those that populated the lands that Hitler is referring to as his Old West. At the same time, and this is just part of the weird contradictions of Nazism, there is this kind of like way that the German ideology for Nazis and the Volk that they idealize, they draw on the colonial romance, and they see Western Europe as like, oh, they're coming in, and that the German Volk have to like defend their native land against the incursion of all of these outside forces. And again, then that stereotype gets placed onto the cosmopolitan Jews, who, so like, in that stereotype of Jewish people, they're Jewish people then thrive in capitalism, and that's trying to take over the simple folk of Volk of Germany, right? So it doesn't really matter, like that, like doesn't matter how contradictory racism is. It's used in whatever way it is to demonize whoever the racist people don't want to have around, right? But the U.S. is definitely, and its legal policies towards natives ends up being the precursor to the concentration camp in the 20th century. Yes, we could go back to the encomienda system all the way with the Spanish and see that as an earlier form of the reservation as well. And if we're thinking about tracing the history of concentration camps. Um, so turn back to Geronimo's story and his captivity. By 1874, after white immigrants demanded federal military intervention, Apaches were forced onto a reservation in Arizona. Geronimo and a band of followers escaped, and U.S. troops tracked him relentlessly across deserts and mountains of the West. Badly outnumbered and exhausted by a pursuit that had gone on for 3,000 miles and which included help from Apache scouts, Geronimo finally surrendered to General Nelson A. Miles at Skeleton Canyon in Arizona in 1886 and turned over his Winchester rifle to Sheffield Bowie knife. He was anxious to make the best terms possible, says Miles. Geronimo and his renegades are agreed to a 2-year exile and subsequent return to the reservation, but then he was never allowed to return. In New York, President Grover Cleveland fretted over the terms. In a telegram to his Secretary of War, Cleveland wrote, "I hope nothing will be done with Geronimo which will prevent our treating him as a prisoner of war." If we cannot hang him, which I would much prefer. So there is this worry that he's famous enough that killing him might be a bad idea, but then the U.S. doesn't want to actually return him to his actual country either. So while the POWs were in Florida, the government then relocated hundreds of their children from their Arizona reservation to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. So again, just another version of the boarding school genocidal situation as well. That school was in Pennsylvania. More than a third of the students quickly perished from tuberculosis and died as though smitten with the plague, the Post reported. Apaches lived in constant terror that more of their children would be taken from them and sent east. So I've got a link here with Geronimo's appeal to Theodore Roosevelt, who he met. Roosevelt put him in a parade and parades him through Washington. So, as a prisoner of war, he's paraded through Washington, D.C., and then visits the Carlisle Indian School. Roosevelt is really showing him off in his inaugural parade as a famous Indian who has now been captured by the U.S. government. And so we see this kind of with the Wild West show as well, right? Where this shifting as the country has gained power over native lands, that at the same time, native people are being put onto display for entertainment, right? Either in the Wild West show of Buffalo Bills, or in this case, in actual political parades. Um, uh, so uh, he and five real Indian chiefs, because again, like Geronimo is often thought of or portrayed as a chief, but he did not have that title. Um, uh, who wore headgear and painted faces, rode horses down Pennsylvania Avenue. The intent, one newspaper stated, was to show Americans that they have buried the hatchet forever. So wanted to deal with Geronimo. So like why does the did the US military all the way into the 21st century refer to someone like Osama bin Laden as Geronimo, right? And of course more to be said about the like why is enemy territory still referred to by the US military as Indian territory, right? This is of course the legacy of the cavalry in the US Army already going back to the 19th century, but it shows the perpetuation of a metaphysics of Indian hating, which is a chapter title that comes from a Herman Melville book called The Confidence Man, but it's also the subtitle for a really, really good book called Facing West. Um, uh, um, by my brain is not working well this morning, but the last names of the author starts with a D, and it'll pop into my head in just a minute here. Published around 1980. But you can look Facing West, the metaphysics of Indian hating. Um, so I'm going to get Chief Ure in here as well. So Ure is a Ute chief, and the Ute reservation is to this day, anyway, that I'm making this lecture, is the only reservation that still has at least part of itself in present day Colorado. But when we look at Chief Ure's original negotiations between President Lincoln and Grant, and then John Evans, who becomes, the governor of Colorado Territory in the 1860s, he negotiates for about a third of what is present day Colorado. This will be the western third of the state. So a lot of the mountains, and of course, that's where the town in Colorado named for Chief Ure is put. Now, Ure becomes a controversial figure in and of himself, especially for Plains folks over here, because he did that negotiating with the U.S. government. So at the time when the dog soldiers, the Lakota dog soldiers, are being chased down, and then eventually the rhetoric of chasing down dog soldiers is what gets used to perpetuate the Sand Creek massacre on Black Kettle and his folks, who also had negotiated with Lincoln. Ure was negotiating through Kit Carson with John Evans and Lincoln for almost a third of what is now Colorado. So here I have a picture. So this would be Colorado territory over here, and then this is Utah, right? And of course, like as always, the United States government does not hold up uh, bargain, and so then we get that the squashing down of what is Ute Mountain Reservation and then the Southern Ute Reservation as well, and down in Durango. If you go to Fort Lewis College, there's a heavy sort of emphasis on the Ute population down there. So there's some history links there for Colorado. And that's why I think, for those of you who are my students here in Denver, Colorado, we're on the eastern slope of the mountains and connected to the Great Plains. And so the territory out here is oftentimes referred to as Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota passing through territory. Of course, Osage people, like as my friend Tink Tinker will say, made yearly journeys to the Colorado mountains and didn't seem to have any kind of violent encounters with other natives. So this idea that natives are all just fighting each other um, uh, is part of a racist history. At the same time, political conflicts do arise, as with between Lakota and Crow people, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture. And then there's a split between Southern and Northern Arapaho and Cheyenne folks. And like sometimes people like Blackhead try to take this path of waving the white flag or negotiating with the U.S. government. Ure deals with the same sort of situation. Geronimo was forced into the same situation. He makes an agreement to be in exile for 2 years, but then never is able to return. And so the bottom line is that the U.S. government is not a good partner for any Native person to be dealing with at any particular time. And some resistance movements last longer than others. Um, when we're thinking about um, uh, peoples of the Southwest, want to make some interesting observations about language here. We've got Athabascan languages, and I've got this kind of blurry map here, but like this is really interesting because we see all the way up to what's now Alaska and northwestern Canada. We see a lot of Inuit peoples, for examples, who speak Athabascan language, and then we see pockets down in Oregon, Northern California, and the Southwest, and a little bit over in Oklahoma here because of reservations. People who speak this language, and that's going to be a really different language family if you're into linguistics than um, uh, the Udo-Aztecan languages that are spoken down in the South. So Navajo, Southern Athabascan languages are Navajo or Dene and Apache. So Dene and Apache people share a linguistic ancestry in the same way that like Lakota and Washaje or Osage, they come from the same language family as well. And so they might have a lot of shared words or that we call in linguistics cognate words, where like a root of a particular word has the same meaning across the two different languages. And so what we see is this kind of cultural um, not always conflict, but sometimes it develops into conflict between those people who've been living in the Southwest regions who, have a lot of ties down to Central America. Even some of the current day Pueblo cultures trace their stories all the way back to Maya people down in Guatemala and Mexico. And so we've covered this in a much earlier lecture in the course, all the way with Chaco Canyon and the way that Chaco Canyon as a city is located in a north-south axis with Pekime and Palenque. This is more recent information that's come out. And so when we're thinking about linguistic language dispersal and how we can see how people have moved about at different places in time and living at different times, we can see cultural spread. Now, language difference doesn't have to mean conflict with between different peoples, but we can definitely see that it might be harder to communicate. So today, Dene language and the Dene reservation surrounds the Hopi reservation, which would be closer related to the Puebloan cultures. So Hopi is a Udo-Aztecan language like Shoshone, and Shoshone people are living up even north of this in Utah and western Wyoming. Also, Paiute is another language here. So to be thinking about um, versus Athabascan languages. Uh, So when we're thinking about Dene people or Navajo people, um, uh, the forced removal of Navajo people ends up being called the Long Walk, which I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. I've got a link here. And again, Blackhawk covers some of that in his book. So, but I've got a map here of original Navajo homelands and I'll get to the Native American church here in a minute here. But I'll go back to my other map. So Navajo Nation lands, then after the long walk, they're allowed to return, but their territory is reduced. Really, Navajo people are up quite north into Utah as well, up in here. uh, Dene folks. And later on in the 20th century, sometimes there's some conflict that shows up between Dene people and Hopi people. But then again, that's part of the relationships. Really, that's an antagonism that really has more to do with their various relationships to the U.S. government and reservations than necessarily with any kind of traditional animosity between the two groups. In 1918, we see the formal establishment of what's called the Native American Church. The traditions that occur within the Native American Church are much older, and you'll remember from my earlier lectures, some of them cross with ghost dance practices that develop in the mid 19th century, and some of them don't. Also, some use peyote and some don't. Some groups, native groups, use peyote and some don't. And this like shows up, the kind of divisions show up around with some of the Southwestern cultures. So sometimes some Navajo folks like initially don't want anything to do with peyote, but now like I sometimes have students who are Dene and they belong to the Native American church or something like that. So there's much more to be said and thought about with respect to that. Also, overtly, part of the deal with the Native American church was that overtly it adopted a Christian theology, at least on the surface. And anthropologists at the time who saw themselves as allies to the Native American church helped like promoted that idea, basically saying like, well, if you form a church and you call yourselves Christians or you adopt that, then maybe you might be able to practice, like use that as a shell to practice some traditional ceremonial things, including the ingestion of peyote medicine. Now that occurs, if we're thinking about 1918, that occurs after that 1883 legislation that the Indian Crimes Act that basically criminalizes any kind of Native American religion, right? From 1883. And we talked about Senator Teller from Colorado in that particular time period. So basically, although traditional practices were continually under assault from Euro-Christians from the beginning of their arrival here, we see from 1883 all the way until the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, this overt, especially in this area out in the plains in the Southwest, we see the overt criminalization of native traditional practices in dancing, anything that seems ceremonial or quasi, in quotes, religious as well. Now, during this time, and from the Dawes Act and from the reservation, or sorry, the boarding schools, the residential schools, we've seen this long process throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries of trying to force Native peoples to assimilate to the white or Euro-Christian dominant culture, such that by 1924, we get this thing called the Snyder Act. Now, when we think about this and go back to military history, this is after World War One, and you've seen a lot of these Native Americans who don't have formal citizenship, who've been fighting, nevertheless, in U.S. military on behalf of the U.S. government. So that definitely um, creates a kind of sympathy within some circles for people wanting to, thinking that they're doing a good thing by extending U.S. citizenship to all Native peoples and then saying, okay, now you can vote in elections and all of that sort of stuff. At the same time, from a Native perspective, from many Native people's perspective, the Citizenship Act imposes citizenship on natives. And so this is an important thing to think about in terms of the difference between, say, African American freedom struggles in this country or the Black freedom struggle after slavery, right? Which is Black history continually tells a story of wanting to be recognized and acknowledged as full citizens within broader US culture, right? So it's a story of becoming legally represented. But for Native peoples, and it can be different in different communities, but for many Native peoples, citizenship in the United States is the acceptance of a colonizing government. So it's actually an imposition. It's not a good thing, right, from a Native perspective. And so the Haudenosaunee, our oldest confederacy that still exists today, immediately responded to the Snyder Act, saying this is a bunch of crap. We are our own people. We should issue our own passports to our own citizens. There are many Native people who see the reservations that they live on as nation to nation treaty agreements with the US government. So why don't Pine Ridge citizens, for example, issue their own passports? And why do not they not have border checks for regular US citizens entering onto Pine Ridge Reservation, for example? And that goes back to those the Marshall trilogy of cases, right? From Johnson v. McIntosh, Cherokee versus State of Georgia, and Worcester versus Georgia, where Native peoples are being regarded as domestic dependent nations. Uh, so there's a mixed reception even today in terms of what U.S. citizenship means for Native peoples. In 1934, we get a sea change in US government policies towards Native Americans with this Indian agent named John Collier. Now, John Collier, for some Native peoples, he's seen as a friendly figure, and for other Native folks, he's just another in a long line of people who are meddling and screwing up things with Native cultures. So but he is definitely a major figure behind the Indian Reorganization Act. And uh, at least one of the things that the Reorganization Act addresses is um, the injustices of the 1887 Dawes Act, while also creating commercial relationships with the reservations and trying to buy back and selling land domestically. So then in 1944, we see the formation of the National Council of the American Indian, which still exists today. You can be on their email list. I'm on their email list. NCAI was established in 1944 in response to termination and assimilation policies that the U.S. government forced onto tribal governments in contradiction of their treaty rights and status as sovereign nations. To this day, protecting these inherent legal rights remains the primary focus of the NCAI. So there's some other legislation that happens in the 1940s where that allows for Native Americans to file grievances with the US government. And so this is a push and pull with Native peoples becoming considered closer as citizens within the United States instead of just separate foreign nations too, right? And so with that, there's all sorts of legal complexity that continues all the way into the Indian Civil Rights Act in the 1960s as well, which we'll cover in a later lecture. Another thing we want to deal with along these lines and during this period is the creation of national parks. Because when Native peoples today sometimes are making public statements like hashtag land back, for example, at least one of the things on in terms of issues is federal land that's taken from Native peoples and then made into national parks. So why not, in some cases, I mean, if our current president, Donald Trump, and Trump 2.0, as I like to call it, is diminishing the federal government in all sorts of ways. And you might think of it from a Native American perspective and be like, okay, well, if all funding is being taken away from national parks, why doesn't that land, why not give the land back to Native peoples or let Native people become the people who take care of the parks or create that as an option as well? There's a Ward Churchill book called Struggle for the Land that actually kind of makes a case for some of that sort of stuff in one of his final chapter of that book for the creation of of an Indian of formalized politically recognized Indian country, right, which has always been an ongoing pursuit for Native peoples all the way back to dealings of with the British government during the Seven Years' War, for example. So we see the first national park showing up in the 1770s after the closing of treaty relations with Native peoples that end in 1868, right, with that second treaty of Fort Laramie. We see Yellowstone being created in 1772, Mackinac, Michigan, 1875, Rock Creek around the same time when National Capital Parks in DC. We see 1890 Sequoia, California, and Yosemite National Park in California, Mount Rainier in Washington near Seattle, Wind Cave in South Dakota. But also Wind Cave is one example where we have actual Lakota origin stories. So I've given a link here that you can look up. The slides are in the Canvas modules if you want to open it and then click on the link, or else you can definitely look it up just by pausing this and typing some of it in. And then 1915, more closer to where I live, is Rocky Mountain National Park here in Colorado. So I've got in the modules and Canvas for this week some of the formal stuff around the U.S. Citizenship Act. Again, this might be something that's good to dig into more for a final paper for the class. But what the Onondaga do, or the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, they respond immediately saying this is a bunch of crap, right? That the U.S. government's trying to impose citizenship on us. And so what's interesting that they do is they go to the League of Nations. So the League of Nations is an international group, a treaty-bound group that forms in Europe after World War I. Now, President Wilson is Woodrow Wilson is at first involved in that process of creating the League of Nations, but then he backs out of the League of Nations. So the U.S. backs out and then doesn't rejoin until after World War II when the League of Nations becomes the United Nations. So what is interesting is what we see, and we've seen this all along throughout Native American history in negotiations with different European powers, is this nation to nation type of agreement, and a conception of peoples as nations, interacting in terms of international law. So, for example, I've mentioned that for Haudenosaunee people, they were never invited to the end of the Seven Years' War. So, in their minds, from the land, right? That perspective from the land, that is a conflict that has been ongoing, right? So the reason rationales for calling the president of the United States, for example, town destroyer, those legacies tie into a really long and continuing memory among Native groups. At the same time, now that there has become, since the 20th century, an international stage for looking at the recognition of nations around the world, we see Native Americans jumping right into that politics, to that business. And in that sense, sometimes they have to show up in ways that mark them visually. Like, so setting up teepees in um in the Netherlands, right? Outside of the UN, wearing headdresses, showing up in regalia, right? Um, in the same ways that performing Indianness becomes part of the politics of the Buffalo Bill show, or becomes part of the ways that Teddy Roosevelt is parading Geronimo down Pennsylvania Avenue along with other Indian leaders, right? So, the complexity of what politics means according to what people wear. So, for example, I was testifying at the state capitol a few years ago against the Columbus Day holiday alongside a lot of the Native community here. And you're not supposed to wear political, like t-shirts with political slogans on them when you testify. And one of this was like completely illegitimate, if you ask my perspective, but one of the racist discriminations that one of the members of one of the state's representatives did was when a particular woman, from the community, an Apache woman, Apache and Shawnee woman named Sky Morris, who um, at least right now is caretaker for Winds American Indian Council, over here off of Fifth and Bannock Street in Denver, which is land that has been negotiated as land back agreement to Native peoples from the Lutheran Synod, and that was negotiated by Washaje, um, uh, my colleague Tink Tinker, who used to be the caretaker of that land. This is a liberated zone here in Colorado in territory. In any case, Sky Morris was wearing a traditional um, dress that had been made and patterned together. She was wearing some traditional um, uh, dress, and one of the racist representatives barred her from being able to speak because he said that she was wearing political clothing, right? When she went to testify against the Columbus Day. It was but one of many uh, ways that politicians try to silence Native people, especially in that respect, Native women. Um, Native women are raped and murdered at a higher rate than any other group, per capita, right, for per population. Native men are closely behind Native women as well. But there is this interesting thing where the heavy amount of violence that is done to missing and indigenous women, missing and murdered indigenous women across the country. But when they speak out, they are immediately attacked by the U.S. government. Happened to another water protector up around Standing Rock, a person from the local community here in Denver named Red Fawn Fallis as well, who was received particularly aggressive treatment by the U.S. government and the FBI, who infiltrated her personal life in ways that exceed this, what I can go into in this lecture here. But you can look into court records, into Colorado American Indian movement history there as well. So Red Fawn Fellis is a Lakota woman, I believe. So this stuff continues on in local histories. And part of wearing regalia and showing up in ways that mark Native peoples as Native peoples becomes part of the political process for looking for recognition, sometimes in the international community when the United States government will not recognize people as na their own nations. So Descahe, which is it's a ceremonial term. It's not this guy's name. His name, Levi General Cayuga Man, gets the title Descahe, and he goes to the League of Nations in the 1920s to address this particular issue. You can look up, or in the Canvas modules I have, um, uh, his Red Man's appeal for justice. So again, yes, is that racialized language, the red man stuff? Yes, but it's adopting that as a way to appeal to justice. He also is responding to Canada's Enfranchisement Act from 1919, and then, of course, later on the 1924 U.S. Citizenship Act. So these theatrical tactics set the stage for later indigenous efforts in the international theater, especially in the late 70s and ongoing up until we get the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples being signed in 2007. Now that's a watered down treaty in many ways, and many Native peoples are not happy with that. So I don't want to say that things are necessarily all good now. But we see a long, long history if we think about Native American politics of alliances across different Native nations. So we might call them pan-Indian alliances, for example, not just with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but we've seen it throughout Tecumseh. We see it to a certain extent with Pontiac early on. And these are all responses that will eventually inform later 20th century responses like the American Indian movement, right? So I know in some cases people say like don't use the term Indian, right? But use Native American. But people weren't starting to use that word Native American until the later half of the 20th century. And people who belonged to the American Indian movement, which was not specific to one particular nation, still use that term amongst themselves, including my colleague, Dr. Tink Tinker, who is part of Colorado American Indian Movement. So when in doubt, ask people how they want to be referred to. Yes, of course, there are Native people who would like to be referred to by their particular nation, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Apache. What kind of Apache? Mescalero Apache, Chiricoa Apache, right? Hopi, Dene instead of Navajo, right? Like there are all sorts of ways to be thinking about things. There isn't one way of addressing Native peoples that's going to work because the history is diverse. And the colonizing forces work differently and to different degrees in different regions of what's now the United States. The assimilation policies, along with outright wars of conquest or wars of extermination, all fall under the legal category of what we now call genocide. So I want to talk about, in the end of this lecture, genocide itself. So, uh, first, the Genocide Convention emerges in the United Nations, which is the United Nations is formed in 1948. Immediately, there's a Genocide Convention, which lasts from 1948 until 51. And then it goes through a process of ratification. So different countries signing on to the agreements of the Genocide Convention. This term genocide is coined by a Jewish scholar named Raphael Lemkin, who's a Polish Jew. And he grows up seeing the discrimination that Jewish people face in Poland. And he becomes a lawyer and he sets out from an early age to create the legal language to deal with what he sees. And so for a long time, he's trying to come up with a term. He eventually settles on genocide for what is an ancient crime. So just because genocide emerges as a term in the 20th century, it's being practiced all the way back into biblical times, right? So uh, A lot of people, when they learn about the term genocide, they associate it with, of course, the Shoah or the catastrophe or the Holocaust of Jewish people, right, in during World War II in Eastern Europe at the hands of the National Socialists or Nazis. And that there's, for obvious reasons, this is a particularly egregious case of genocide. And some people have tried to say that that particular case of genocide is the most special case of genocide. But that kind of thinking waters down the ability to prosecute genocide legally. So what has developed are kind of two different camps within genocide studies, people who become Holocaust scholars, and then people who study this thing notion called comparative genocide, which looks at the crime of genocide as existing and what constitutes that as a crime, legally speaking. And then how the questions about how is that crime going to be punished, right? So all of that complexity shows up all the way into the recent conflicts between the most recent conflicts. They've been going on since the foundation of Israel in 1948 as well, but the most recent conflicts in Gaza with Palestinians and Israel, the Israeli government, although there are plenty of Israeli people who have support for Palestinians there as well. And then it translates over into protests in this country in recent years and months on college campuses, where people who point out or use the term like genocide in relationship to what's going on in Gaza. And different nations in the world have also charged this formally at the United Nations at this point. But in the politics of this country, the back and forth about whether or not to if somebody's making charges of genocide, whether or not they are anti-Israel in some sort of way too, right? So that becomes part of the existing politics, especially on college campuses in recent years and months, where I make this video, and that's why I think it's really important for students not just in Native American history class, to be actually thinking about the history and the process of the term genocide and where it comes from and what it constitutes in an international legal basis, and not just a basis in terms of what people's feelings are about their identity politics, which is another thing to mention. So when we're looking at the term genocide, at least in terms of comparative genocide studies, genocide, there have sometimes been books where people like say like, was what happened to Native Americans genocide or not? It's like generally comparative genocide scholars all agree it is not controversial in any sense to say that the devastation of indigenous peoples in the Americas was always evident to the colonists, and that Europeans on the frontier developed a trope of vanishing narrative natives. We've already seen this a little bit in this lecture with the colonial romance narratives. And that remains the fundamental frame for thinking of our understanding and relationship between progress and the old. Vanishing becomes a romantic notion. The vanishing, you know, powerful warrior chief, right? That's being paraded in terms of Theodore Roosevelt's politics in the early 1900s. Following the work of David Stannard and Ward Churchill, who, despite any controversies around Ward Churchill, he won all of his cases. That some people charged him with plagiarism. That was a political maneuver. He won all of his cases against that, but that doesn't always get followed up around that. But in any case, within genocide studies, Ward Churchill's famous book, A Little Matter of Genocide, is still one of the best books on genocide in general, but also particularly on Native American genocide. But another genocide scholar named Eleazar Barkon notes, quote, "It is generally accepted that over time, the indigenous populations in the Americas declined by more than 95 and even 98% at its lowest point. The situation of temporal erasure persists in daily speech habits among Euro-Christians. Oftentimes, my students who come into my classes with no knowledge of of Native American history tend to refer to Native Americans as if they existed in the past and don't continue to exist. Um, so Euro-Christians constantly frame Native concerns as something of a distant past. They say, why are we talking about this? Why are we bringing this not up now? The past is the past. Well, the past isn't the past when in the 21st century, Ruth Bader Ginsburg still cites Johnson v. McIntosh and Papal Bulls of Discovery for cl claims by the United States against Native Americans, right? The legal situation is continuing, and Native peoples continue to exist as well. And what it goes all the way back to Columbus and even a little bit before Columbus with the Papal Bulls of Discovery. So this is a book. I like this book. It's a collection of different essays, The Specter of Genocide, mass murder in historical perspective, and you can look at a lot of different instances of genocide around the world in that particular book. So when we look at what constitutes genocide according to the United Nations, now the United Nations takes that term from Raphael Lemkin, and it comes from an article that's first coined that I've put into the modules. That's in, I think it's American Scholar was the journal. But he also develops it in his book, I think Axis, Power, and Occupied Europe as well. Raphael Lemkin is a hero of mine in particular, not just for coining the term genocide, but he constantly is going to the United Nations up until his death and living in poverty, just dire poverty, like pulling some like eating other people's like leftover sandwiches kind of stuff. And he dies on the street going to yet another meeting that he's always trying to form at the with people who work at the United Nations to get them to be rigorous in their pursuit of prosecuting the crime of genocide. Now he gives a more detailed description, and in Ward Churchill's book, A Little Matter of Genocide, Churchill really covers this nicely well. How even the United Nations, when they come up with their definition, kind of dilute the definitions that Raphael Lemkin originally came up with. And with that dilution of the original concept of genocide, it makes it harder to actually prosecute and hold people or nations accountable for the crime of genocide. But what I'm going to go over here at the end of lecture today is the um, UN definitions, what they come up with, and this is so what exists in current international law in terms of constituting genocide, the crime of genocide. So that's why when I say even by the softened language, it's softened because it's not as rigorous as what Lemkin actually came up with originally. But even by the softened language of the 1948 United Nations Convention, Genocide Convention, both cultural assimilation and violent death fall under the definition of a crime of genocide. And so this is something for my students to know. Like a lot of times in American imagination, because we actually do learn about the Holocaust against Jewish people, because it makes America look good to be against the occupied or the Axis forces in Europe. So we in our national narrative, we're the great liberators of Jewish people, although during the war, we of course know that like the United States is turning away boatloads of Jews who are looking for refugee status here in the country, right? So we want to be a little bit more careful. And really, even for FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, even when he is more sympathetic to Jews, he does not have the support of the American people who do not want to have Jewish refugees coming here. So that becomes a political issue that I just want to throw out there. Like we're not maybe the heroes that our national history wants to tell us. And just try talking to a Russian person about the sacrifices made in World War II, right? There's about 25 million or more, maybe I think it's closer to 26 million people, Russian people who perish in trying to fight off the Nazis, um, versus more people died during COVID um, uh, than American soldiers died in World War II. Not trying to diminish the sacrifice that American soldiers had during the so-called Great War or the Greatest Generation, as our country tries to call it. But we want to look at it in an international perspective and then think back like, maybe the stories that we tell ourselves as a nation have a different perspective when we look at it from an international situation. And then, of course, the Native American situation as well. So let's look at Article. So basically, Article 1 says that genocide's a crime, and it's a crime that can be that people can be prosecuted against. for. So Article 2 then defines it. Article 2, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A, killing members of the group. And that's where a lot of people's minds just stop. It's like, oh, yes, like people were put into concentration camps and gas chambers, something like that, right? B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. In that case, the policies, blood quantum policies of the United States government that some people still use. And when they're like, I'm like 1/3 Cherokee or like, or something like that. It's like when you're using that kind of language, you're actually using the policies that are genocidal. Because first of all, science and blood, like DNA and all that sort of stuff, doesn't even work that way in terms of percentage of blood. Like what percentage of like as my native friends say, it's like, oh, like I'm 1/8 like this particular nation. I'm 1/8 Cherokee. It's like is that like from your knees down to your shins? Like, come on, let's like be like rigorous about the ways that that kind of thinking is the perpetuation of a colonizing gesture that is meant and always has been meant to assimilate, to dilute, to water down over time and eradicate an entire nation of peoples. Now, that isn't to say that according to treaty relationships that exist today between some native peoples and the US government, that that language of blood quantum doesn't apply to them. In that case, like, you can't have less than a certain amount of like fraction of blood or lineage in order to have enrolled status in a particular native nation, right? So that is a reality that some native peoples face who are living on reservations. If like, my friend Greg, for example, who's a Lenape guy, colleague, friend, the Greg, who, was telling me that like because his daughter has less blood quantum than him and marries another native person from another reservation, but not the same reservation, their children, even though, by all like sort of colloquial accounts of blood quantum being like having native parents, their children would not be able to have like enrolled status as Native Americans in either of the reservations that their parents are from, right? That's an example of the way over time the blood quantum laws are assumed alongside intermarriage with non-Native peoples to dilute and to eradicate all Native Americanness or American Indian identity altogether. That's falls under the Genocide Convention right here. So imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group, forced sterilization, for example, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, boarding schools, for example, forced boarding schools. Article 3 then says that the following acts shall be punishable. A, genocide, also conspiracy to commit genocide. C, direct and public incitement to commit genocide. D, the attempt to commit genocide. And C, complicity in genocide. I would ask my American citizens to what extent you might think whether or not our lack of education are around Native peoples from the time that we're young, the fact that like, what have you learned in this class this semester that you didn't learn in high school, right? The fact that we learn readily in elementary school about Nazi Holocaust of the Jews, but we never learned at that age anyway about genocide, the many genocidal occurrences on this continent towards Native peoples, right? Does that amount to a public policy of complicity in genocide? Do the current endeavors by the US government to erase and get rid of any talking about race, for example, is there an agenda behind that that leaves out an accountability that might be occurring in ongoing legal relationships that we as a nation of people have agreed to in terms of treaty or nation-to-nation agreements with Native peoples. Now we know the history of the U.S. government has not upheld its end to its fullest extent for any of the treaties, but at what point does our historical memory catch up with us? And finally, as I end on this, although in 2007, the United Nations did make a formal declaration of the rights of indigenous peoples, separate from the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that's something to ask yourselves, why does the international community sign on to this? The four of the greatest perpetrator nations of genocide against indigenous peoples that came from English colonies, so the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they refused to sign on to the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, just like it took a long time for the United States to ratify the Convention on the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide. And the reason was because they did not want to be charged with genocide. So in 1951, right when the UN finally finishes the Genocide Convention, right away we get the African American community under W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP. They deliver a paper called We Charge Genocide against Black people in the United States, right? At the United Nations, trying to hold the US accountable. So, what do we see happening in the United States around relationships with African Americans in the 1950s? We see almost immediately this Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, that repeals all segregation policies going back to the late 1890s, right? Plessy versus Ferguson, which established segregation. When we look from an international angle, the pressure back on the United States from the international community, as the United States is trying to say after world that it's the land of the free and the land of opportunity and all this stuff. All it took was the Soviet Union at the time to say, like, look at what the United States does to Native peoples. Look at what the United States does to its Black population. It calls itself free, but it commits genocide against them, right? So, alongside a national effort by the federal government to end segregation in the 1950s, we also see the federal government trying to create policies of termination for Native reservations, incentivizing Native peoples to move to what become urban ghettos, promising all sorts of opportunity and jobs for impoverished Native peoples, because the more people that they can move off of reservations means that they can then dissolve the status of particular Native groups in relationship to the United States government, and the less obligations there are that way, the less the United States government can be charged from an international perspective with the crime of genocide. So it's a way of trying to get out of not only treaty obligations with Native peoples, but also out of the charge in the international theater of genocide. So termination policies is something else you can look up or maybe focus in on for a term paper. And we get from the 1950s and 1960s as a generation of urban Indians that have less affiliation with reservations. And then the identity conflicts and things that the cultural identity conflicts that inhabit many Native peoples who grow up in those urban communities. But we also get new formulations across different Native nations and the pan-Indian movements like the Indians of All Tribes movement or the American Indian movement showing up. So those end up being reactions of survivance, to use the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe writer Gerald Weisner's term. They become survival tactics for younger Native folks from different nations to band together, and that's where that term Native American starts showing up, but also where there's an embracing of that term Indian as opposed to different nations. Now, of course, there's within those movements, there is the call to go back to reservations, to go back to elders, to go back to traditional ways. And so it's during that time of the American Indian movement that the Sundance gets practiced again, begins to be practiced again. So there's this attempt by some members like Russell Means to try to go back to traditional ways. And that, when we see in Native American history, that is a much older impulse. We have seen that over and over again in coalitions that are formed and confederacies that are formed across different Native nations as resistance movements to the Euro-Christian colonizers. Right. So it's not only a phenomenon that arises in the 1960s. When we look at it from a US history perspective, it's like, oh, well, yeah, there was a lot of uprisings in the 1960s. From a Native American perspective, this is just one more example of coalitions that were being formed even before Euro-Christians came to this continent. So you want to be very, very careful about the ways that we think about Native activism all the way up into the 21st century, whether it's Colorado American Indian movement or the branches that start over in Minneapolis as well, or different forms of activist organizations like Idle No More movement up in Canada, or the First Nations is the term used up there, or the recent Standing Rock protests as well, the water protector protests. So I'm going to end that here. So I'll get to a little bit more of that later activism in our last week of class here. But this covers the late 19th century into the 20th century, and I think this is one of the more interesting times and phenomena for our class. So thank you for your attention as always. Um, uh, Enjoy your day, whenever, wherever you are.